In New York, the United Nations General Assembly happens annually. Leaders from all over the world converge on Manhattan, Turtle Bay to be precise, to the United Nations, a place that Donald Trump, by the way, throughout his presidential campaign bemoaned and complained about and said that it should not, even in some circles, exist, that they don't do the job, they need reorganization, criticize. When he got there yesterday, the first thing he did to the press is he pointed out that, hey, just across the street, I have a very successful building. There's a building that we have, it's a Trump building right across the street. It's a terrific building. So he went in, all about Donald Trump, and I think he'll come out of this, 2 more days. He's not done there till Thursday. He's staying at Trump Tower in New York, not done until Thursday. But what he did do today was unprecedented, I think. I would say that I adhere and watch and spend a lot of time on boring congressional television. I don't generally look at the General Assembly, but this time I knew that it would be important. This is the first time that this president is facing the leaders of other countries all at once, and it's important because it's his first foray into that diplomatic discussion. And usually the discussions that come out of the United Nations General Assembly are centered around refugees, around working together, about bailing countries out, about healthcare and climate change. And that was not the case with Donald Trump. Today, Donald Trump took this opportunity to talk about sovereignty, and he said that word so many times. And sovereignty is another word for keeping immigrants out, if you want to know the truth. But it's also about talking about American pride, American power, and he wasted no time when talking about his new favorite nemesis, and that's Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Here is Donald Trump in New York today.
Now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary.
Yep, that's Donald Trump talking about, he was there, right, at the green marble podium, calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man. He did that previously in a tweet. Anna, what do you make of this kind of rhetoric at the United Nations?
Well, the order of sentences in that last statement was interesting because he went from we will destroy North Korea, implying that we would use our nuclear capability against the country should they cease their experiments with their weapons. And then he immediately follows it up with Rocket Man.
Yeah.
So he makes one of the most serious statements that you could possibly make at this meeting, and then follows it up with a childish, label that he's given Kim Jong-un. Look, in the grand scheme of things, who cares what he calls Kim Jong-un? What matters is policy, and what also matters is that we have a leader that we trust to be competent, to deal with something that is not only threatening to us and to those living in North Korea, but also threatening to our allies. And I just don't feel that he is worthy of that trust because he does not strike me as someone who's competent.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's one more thing that matters here too. But you're at the United Nations, you're in the middle of this, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but the whole, whether it's a crisis or not with North Korea, we can talk about. But you're in the middle of this and you're shooting diplomacy out of the way.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, so there's no room where you call him Rocket Man and you say, if you don't do this, we're just gonna blow up your whole country. That means diplomacy is done. And you saw, when you were looking at it, you saw Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the United Nations, and Rex Tillerson, who was the Secretary of State, you saw them there. And when there are other takes of them where they sort of can't, it looks to me, and I'm just reading, how they look.
They look concerned.
That's a better way of putting it. That's a nicer way than I was going to say.
Their eyes shoot down as soon as they realize what he's saying. I mean, not to say that they didn't know ahead of time, but it did feel like those moments during, say, the Academy Awards when the host is doing the monologue and taking pot shots at people in the audience, and then it flashes to some random person and on their face is just written the expression, don't show me, don't show my face, don't show my face right now. That's what it felt like. And then to use that kind of language, it felt not like a throwback to any famous speech that we know of someone bridging the gap between nations, using diplomacy, as you say. It felt like, I think it was like 2006 when you had the leader of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, up there with like Noam Chomsky's book waving it around. and to call him Rocket Man, it feels like he took some kind of like insult, ran it through Google Translator into Korean, then back into American. It felt like the way that Chavez used to call Bush Mr. Danger. Yeah, you're a donkey, Mr. Danger. It felt that weird.
Yeah, and there has been this kind of, there's like precedent. You cite Chavez, there was Fidel Castro showing up with a gun. I mean, there are things that have happened at these General Assemblies and in special addresses to the United Nations. But I can't stop thinking about this being the very first time that he has done this and presenting himself to the world, and this is how he's doing it. And that goes to your whole point about trust.
Right. I mean, I had incredibly low expectations for his speech, and he met those low expectations. So I'm not really shocked by anything. The only thing that is kind of shocking is usually when he says things that are outlandish or worth having some concern about, it's off the cuff. It's not something that's scripted, but he's clearly reading from a prompter there.
That's a great question. I want to ask, he's reading from a prompter, but I think he saw Kim Jong-un and he said Rocket Man. I don't think.
I was wondering about that. Like,
I don't know.
Was that written in the script? Who knows? There's no way of knowing, but it is clear that he is using a teleprompter there because whenever he does speak off the cuff, he has the vocabulary and communication skills of a third grader. But the other thing that I wanted to quickly mention is, this notion that he's a great deal maker. And I'm not talking about him sitting down and trying to be diplomatic with Kim Jong-un. I'm talking about him making a deal with China in regard to the trade and the resources that China gives to North Korea. So I see what he's doing there in that speech. He didn't mention China, but he's implying that China's the issue here. They need to, China itself needs to impose sanctions against North Korea. Okay, then you can use diplomacy in that context to convince Chinese leaders to stop their friendly relationship with North Korea. I mean, that's where your good deal making could come in and be very useful, but he's not really a good deal maker.
It seems like his strategy is, I'm not the head diplomat. The head diplomat's a Secretary of State or my UN ambassador.
Right, who may soon be your Secretary of State because people are saying that Tillerson's tired of this whole deal and dealing with Trump.
Right, and it seems like if I were to apply my knowledge of Donald Trump to my interpretation of this speech, it could all be translated into Rex, hold me back.
Right.
Like, I am gonna rattle my saber. I'm gonna call the guy Rocket Man. I am just as petulant as the boy king of North Korea. And I am going to be that person that can identify with, and then Rex can go in and kind of patch things up, even though Rex has been undercut at every turn since he took
and the president leaves no room for diplomacy. So if you're going to sort of pave the way for Rex fix this or Rex do this, by saying we're gonna blow you away and by demeaning the president or the the supreme leader of North Korea in that way, you're taking out, you're undercutting the ability of the Secretary of State and the diplomatic corps to do anything here, but not just here.
Right.
In Syria, I mean, in the Iran nuclear deal.
That's right.
It's all there's a contagion about this that is unprecedented, it seems, right now. And then this speech, like all the speeches that Donald Trump gives, campaign speech, right? This is what worked on the trail. If you're standing in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, you're going to say, we're going to blow that guy away, Rocket Man. Well, not with that accent, right?
Rocket Man had such a positive connotation, didn't
I mean, he's burning out that fuse up there alone.
Okay, yeah, that's Brett proving that he knows what Elton John is saying in that song because nobody else does, burning up that fuse.
Yeah.
Oh, I think about Family Guy.
Is it burning up the fuse out here
alone? But nobody knows what that is.
That's true.
Right, it's one of those lyrics that nobody knows. I of course, course, I thought, of course, Rocket Richard, Maurice Richard of the Montreal Canadiens, which most of you probably
What if it is?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
I knew you did.
What if using Rocket Man is the most appropriate deep metaphor he can think of? Because Un is alienated out there just trying to get a connection with someone. Maybe Trump, he's like bringing out his chops as an English major. Could I fade into the background of this graphic more?
Look at
the
that.
Answer is no.
That's pretty good.
The answer is no at all.
Well, and there are the frustrating thing about Donald Trump is you don't hear the detractors. You don't hear Republicans saying about that this is irresponsible. You don't hear it enough, certainly, and I know that people are waiting for that, and I'm confident that that will come. It did not come today. Lindsey Graham, who you'll recall, Donald Trump gave out his cell phone number during the campaign. Donald Trump made light of his candidacy, which was worthy of being made light of, but he's somebody who Donald Trump has taken to task at different times. Lindsey Graham goes on television. This is what he said.
Every military expert says there is no good military option.
They're wrong. There is a military option to destroy North Korea's program and North Korea itself. He's not going to allow President Trump the ability of this madman to have a missile to hit America. If there's going to be a war to stop him, it will be over there. If thousands die, they're going to die over there. They're not going to die here. And he's told me that to my face.
Yeah, I mean, that was earlier this summer, we should point out. But this is a consistent message from Lindsey Graham, that told me that to my face, and he is buying into it. He said, when he told it to my face, I didn't challenge him.
Yeah, well, I think he's buying into it for a specific reason. And I don't think that Trump leaving out any room for diplomacy is an accident. And what I'm about to say sounds conspiratorial, it's speculation. I want to be clear with our audience. This isn't based in, evidence and reporting. But it's my view of what's going on, because there's a story that we're about to cover after we finish covering this regarding increasing taxpayer money toward the military. And right now there's a good deal of fear-mongering happening among our lawmakers, and it has to do with Iran, it has to do with North Korea, it has to do with, these dangerous refugees that are trying to come into the country. And I don't think, my perception is, they're not escalating, the rhetoric or, antagonizing the enemy without a reason. There's a reason, and the reason is to convince Americans to support funneling more of our taxpayer money to the military, even given the fact that we know without a shadow of a doubt that there's a tremendous amount of waste going on at the Pentagon. And so I don't know, maybe I'm giving Trump too much credit, because that would indicate that he's actually strategizing.
Well, yeah, which is always tough to do, but it does bring up the question, what you just said, of this whole North Korea story, and whether or not it is the media, that we and the media as a whole are responsible for the escalation of this thing to a certain degree. That there's so much hyperbole out there now about this, that there was not really a threat. These two nations were not at the brink of war, North Korea and the United States. And now, because of the constant, yes, he's testing them. Yes, there are problems with South Korea and North Korea. I'm not making light of the global implications of it and the situations here, but it wasn't as big as it is now. And it wasn't as close as it was now. And you didn't have leaders saying that they're going to do this.
Well, the story wasn't as big as it is now, because we didn't have leaders escalating the situation when we don't need to be escalating it, right? There was no, sorry to interrupt you, there was no conversation on cable news where one of the options was to destroy North Korea, because the fact of the matter is North Korea is full of people who are being oppressed, who are innocent, who are doing nothing wrong. They're unfortunately being, they've been taken control by a dictator, and it's been like that for some time now. And so to just, nonchalantly talk about destroying North Korea and murdering innocent people is absurd. I'm sure would break war crimes.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And also our allies would be negatively impacted by that as well. And so it just shows either Lindsey Graham has a complete misunderstanding of how things work and what that would really entail, or he does know and he's just the type of person who doesn't care about the ramifications.
He loves the military, Lindsey Graham. He loves the fact that he was a judge advocate general. He loves all that. And it's always been part of what he sells. But I think the point you make is absolutely spot on. I mean, we've been led by fish that have been swimming by the bait for a long time. And now we have one dumb fish who's like, there's a piece of bait and he bites into it, and then this happens, right?
Yeah.
And then the media covers it and voraciously, and I think that's what happened.
I don't want to get into a land war in Asia, or that's from Princess Bride, but I don't want to get into a land war in North Korea. It feels like Kim Jong Kevin McAllister has been spending the last 70 years booby trapping that. It's going to be like Home Alone.
Yeah,
I think that'd be terrible.
Yeah, it would be terrible, and he is trying to seduce this into happening to some degree, or at least, this is the campaign Trump again. I mean, I talked about it a second ago. This is the guy who loved. This is what he sold out in America, and this is what they bought, and so he'll keep selling it.
But remember that strange moment when Trump kind of humanized Kim Jong-un along the campaign trail, where he's like, I get this guy, he's got a powerful dad, he's trying to define himself, he's a pretty smart, sharp cookie or whatever.
Right, I mean, because they're the same person.
They are the same person. That's what's so terrifying about it.
Right.
Is that they'll do the same thing back and forth until something terrible happens.
And their father willed to them an empire, and they've almost both bankrupted it at different times and seen it rise. And the comparison is unbelievable.
Help us build independent media. Become a member of the Young Turks. TYTnetwork.com/join.